Welcome to today's Cleantech podcast, which is a republish of a 2018 interview with Paul Hesberg, an expert on wildfires and senior research ecologist at the Pacific Northwest Research Station. 5 years ago, he talked to me about managing our forests with controlled burns, thoughtful land development, and how homeowners can actually be more proactive themselves with their own properties before wildfire season. He discusses how if we take a proactive approach collectively and allow for more prescribed burning, it will make economic sense as well as save homes and lives. He also points out that smoke from control burns is less toxic than particulates from wildfires. Fast forward to 2023, and I've just lived through my own personal experience in the Okanagan on the west side with the McDougall Creek fire. I'm now seeing controlled burns after the fire burned out of control and almost 200 properties burned. The air quality was extremely hazardous and toxic here for days, and no doubt there'll be long-term effects. Paul says the question moving forward for all of us is really about, are the fires going to be prescribed or wild? And we have more control than we think. Please listen to this very knowledgeable man and use it as a resource moving forward, and contact your local, provincial, and federal government with your insight and ideas.
For our listeners that don't know your background, can you give us a brief history and then take us to your current role as a research landscape ecologist?
You bet. I obtained a doctorate at Oregon State University in about 1984, and since then I've been studying inland Northwest landscapes, changes to them, and disturbance processes for about the last 34 years. And in my lab, we reconstruct landscapes. We look at their conditions in the early and late 20th century, and we document the key changes. And then we translate those changes into how they influence disturbance processes like bark beetle outbreaks and wildfires, things like that. And when we study these large landscapes, we're sort of beamed out visually to observe larger scale phenomena. And one thing that we see in province after province is that things like fire exclusion, grazing, pest harvesting methods, those things collectively have created a significant increase in the area of forest, and that's occurred in most forest types. And this lack of fire has eliminated once extensive patchworks of grassland, shrubland, sparse woodland. Woodlands are like savannas. And then recently burned ground, and this, what we call early seral patchwork, was highly influential to the landscape. These burned and recovering areas help the rest of the forest to be forest, in fact. So these non-forest areas end up being important to forest. They help to regulate the flow of more benign fire across the landscape because the primary fuels are flashy grasses and shrubs. And the density of the forest we found in many of these reconstructed landscapes has increased in the drier pine and mixed conifer forest too. So these changes together, more forest area and denser forest, have tipped the scale towards basically more common and extensive crown fires and away from this more varied fire ecology.
So you're traveling around the country right now, and you're definitely one of the most cited experts on this topic. Can you talk about strategies that can be implemented to prevent and manage these fires moving forward, and how we can be more proactive versus a reactive approach in this?
You bet. We actually have a lot of options moving forward. We can reduce the severity of many of the wildfires that we're currently facing. The climate's steadily warming, and that influences the annual area burned, and annual area burned is going to increase in the coming decade substantially. Some forecasts suggest 2 to 4 times the area burned since 2000 it will burn by 2030. But it's fuel abundance and its availability to burn that drives the severity or the intensity of many of today's fires, especially as they affect tree mortality. To reduce fire severity, it's critical to address the fuels that have accumulated over the period of fire exclusion, which in many places is 80 to 100, 120 years. And a lot of fuels accumulate. There are numerous methods that we can use. We can use prescribed burning. For example, that's intentionally burning when the weather and the fuels allow so that we get moderate fire effects. We can combine prescribed burning after mechanical thinning Sometimes these restorative treatments are expensive, and so it's helpful to underwrite some of the treatments if, in fact, there's a commercial opportunity. In addition, prescribed burning can't occur in some stands where the densities are too thick and there's too many fuel ladders. So mechanical thinning helps us to create conditions that we can regulate prescribed burning more effectively in. We can do mulching, and we can use managed wildfire. So the application that we use is determined by the conditions that foresters and fire managers find. And it's also conditioned by the social license that's available within the local surrounding community of a forest. If there isn't any commercial opportunity, thinning would obviously have to be subsidized or it's impractical. Sometimes the fuel buildup is so great after a century of fire suppression and fire exclusion that fire alone treatments are impossible because fire behavior will be extreme or unpredictable, even with prescribed burning. In many cases, after naturally occurring ignitions under moderate fire weather, fire managers can use these natural ignitions to burn up surface fuels and thin out the trees. That's a particularly effective treatment, but it can't be done everywhere. And then maintenance treatments are usually involved at 3 to 5 year cycles that involve continued prescribed burning. But there isn't a lot of smoke associated with these maintenance burns. Mulching involves breaking up the shrub and understory fuels with a mechanical mulching head and mixing those broken up pieces in with the soil.
Just recently, the USDA Secretary, Sonny Perdue, announced a new strategy for treating overstocked forests in the U.S. to reverse this trend. Can you talk about his strategy and how you see this rolling out and if you think it will be effective?
So the report that just came out signals a change in the scope and direction of management in USDA Forest Service. And it'll begin to deal at an appropriate scale with wildfire and other forest health problems. And in order to implement, it's clear that they're going to work closely with partners and stakeholders to accomplish that. And then it makes sense that the agency would lead with announcing a change in management focus and the rationale behind the change, and that later they would follow with details on how they intend to accomplish those ends. And so those details haven't come out as yet. So essentially we have had an announcement of a new strategy, and it's going to be important as events unfold to take note of how the planning and implementation will occur to better understand the intentions of the strategy and the methods that are going to be featured to achieve its ends.
Do you have any indication from your perspective how long this will take to roll out, or since it's just in the initial stages of discussion?
I don't. I think there's an awful lot of good minds working on it, and I'm as anxious as you all to see how this unfolds.
So for people that might dispute the strategies you've unfolded, can you give us some examples of towns or districts or countries that are already using controlled burns and the fire prevention methods you discussed and their success so that we can say, yes, it does work?
Sure. So there's a number of communities that are working on a national strategy that's got buy-in from the tribes, national parks, wilderness areas, national forests, states across the West. And it's called the National Cohesive Wildland Fire Management Strategy. And there are communities throughout the United States that are actually making headway. The strategy's got 3 legs. The first is to develop fire-adapted communities. So that means homeowners, businesses, housing developments, they get their homes, yards, and their landscaping ready for the fires that are coming. And it's pretty clear the fires are coming. And they apply the International WUI Code, and they begin to more wisely consider where they're not going to develop. There's 60 to 70% of the new housing starts are in this flammable and dangerous mess. And so having communities really look seriously about where they're going to develop is really important. It's about prevention and proaction rather than reaction. The second step is to maintain a safe and effective fire suppression effort. That means putting out fires as best we can, and they're going to gobble up the landscape and burn down homes. But when there are natural ignitions and the fire weather cooperates, we can allow a number of these natural ignitions to work safely as managed wildfires, basically thinning out trees and burning up dead wood. And there are a number of forests throughout the West where this is being accomplished during the wildfire season. And the third leg of the stool is to manage for resilient landscapes. So that means we change the way fires and fire behavior can come to our forests and our communities before the wildfire season. And that's with some of these restorative treatments. And we can use a lot of the treatments that I discussed earlier in your questioning to accomplish those sort of three legs of the stool. Some example communities are the Lake Tahoe community. National forests in Montana that are managing the Blackfoot and the Swan River drainages. In Wenatchee, Washington, where I live, we're actually implementing quite a bit of this. Ashland, Oregon is a leading location. Boulder, Colorado, Yosemite National Park, Summit County, Colorado. These are examples of places where folks are really getting their act together and they're moving out.
So when you look at the economics of this, I'm assuming they've got a big win. So can you give us an idea of what data looks like when you look at the economic savings of taking a leading role proactively versus, the rising costs of dealing with fighting fires and the loss of properties and lives that we're seeing?
You bet. It's a really great question. So the current data suggests that the post-fire expenses to forests and impacted communities far outweigh the suppression costs by 5 to 25 times, and in rare cases by more than 100 times. So if you figure annual suppression costs in the U.S. typically exceed $2 to $3 billion, these numbers alone suggest that proactive investments in the billions make good economic sense. Likewise, there's ample data to show that thinning and burning treatments effectively protect treated forests from fire effects as long as the thinning slash is burned. If the thinning slash is left behind, the situation is often made worse. The real linchpin is getting that slash burned, and we all want to live smoke-free, and that's not an option. And so getting the slash burned is about managing the smoke. And the fulcrum, sort of the pivot point, is that we're either going to have less smoke from prescribed burning or lots more smoke from wildfires. And it's the wildfire smoke that's damaging to humans. It's highest in the PM 2.5 emissions. So changing our smoke management rules to allow for more prescribed burning is at the heart of making a great deal of forward progress. So the post-fire expenses, the savings that we can produce with proactive work, I think, is really the nut of it. And to free ourselves up to do that, we actually have to be able to make more managed prescribed burning smoke. It's basically better smoke.
So looking at the contributing factors, just from your perspective and from the data that you've seen, how much of climate change is a factor and how much is it just that we're not doing this right?
Well, for me, it's a little bit glib to think about it as we're just not doing it right. Climate change, an awful lot of the management things that have collectively contributed to sort of this epidemic of trees, those were unwitting events that sort of unfolded over time. A warming climate's responsible for the expanding annual area burn. That's a real thing. It's well documented, and annual area burned is likely to increase. But increased fuels explain increased fire severity to a great extent. And I think it's important to be clear that public lands weren't intentionally mismanaged, and oftentimes that's put on those land managers. The factors that collectively contributed to increasing fire hazard are the unfortunate consequence of not knowing how they would work together to create these conditions. For 50 or 60 years, we were amazing at putting out nearly all fires, but we didn't know that from 1935 to 1985, we were aided by a much cooler and moister climate, and it made our efforts at fire suppression look amazing. And so folks thought, hey, I think we can keep fire out of the woods. And then the climate shifted to warmer and drier conditions after 1985. We've learned a lot from studying historical conditions, changes to the landscape, and how they've changed in the modern era. So when you stop and think about it, The one factor that we can really influence is the fuels that have accumulated, the increased forest area and the increased density. And we can learn from the historical landscapes directions that we can move to create more resilient forests.
I think a lot of people right now are living in these areas are feeling helpless. They're terrified of each season is getting worse. So looking at it from, a global issue and a local issue, how can we play a role? How can we start as individuals, taking a role to be part of this strategy and changing things moving forward?
We have 193 million acres of national forests. These are public lands. These are the people's forests. They're our forests. We can work with our local communities and our local forests, take the initiative to accomplish the restorative work. We can make our homes safe for wildfire before the fires come. There's an awful lot of resources at firewise.org that homeowners can make to get their landscaping, their yards, their homes ready for fires so that if a fire comes in the surrounding area, firefighters will be able to protect their home. They'll save their home. We can work with the forests that surround us and forge agreement on how we want to manage these lands going forward. There's going to be an awful lot of fire and smoke in the future, and what we really have available to us is the possibility of changing the kind of fire that we have. Is it going to be prescribed or is it going to be wild? Is the smoke going to be coming from prescribed burns or from wildfire burns? There's basically a good fire, bad fire conundrum here, and we have the opportunity to roll up our sleeves as communities, decide what we want, and get it done. I've been going on a tour giving a public presentation called the Era of Megafires, and we've gone to over 100 Western communities in the last 3 summers talking about this. And communities are smart. They get it. And they know what they have to do. And I think we just have to get about the business of getting it done. Folks need to talk about what they value, what they want, and then make an effective plan with their local forest to achieve those values and goals. And they need to focus on shared values and shared goals rather than the differences which seem to be highlighted so much today in the media. We need to sort out the methods that we can all live with to achieve those ends. And most of all, we need to make it clear to our elected officials at all levels what we're willing and unwilling to live with as end results and work with them to obtain those end results.
On a personal closing note, I always like to ask a personal question at the end. There's an initiative in Vancouver. It's an art initiative. It's called All the Trees. And there's an area in Point Grey where people are writing letters to a tree, and they've actually got artists and Indigenous people answering them. So if you were going to write an email or a letter to a tree, what would you say? Since this is your life, this is, what you understand, what you research, what would you say to the trees right now?
What would I say to the trees? Well, I've been studying wildfires and their role in the forest for a long time, and I would say to the tree that I understand that you too must live with wildfire. It's a beginning and an end for trees and for forests. It's the cycle of renewal. Forests begin after fires. They grow in, they're young and vital. And as they age, they're thinned by fires. Sometimes they're burned. And I would say to the tree, thanks for the service you perform. You provide habitat. As a live tree, you provide habitat as a snag. You provide habitat as a down log. You amend the soil as charcoal after fires. You serve us for 1,000, 1,500 years in one of these forms. It's amazing what you provide for us. Thank you.
That's beautiful. Thank you very much, and thanks for joining us today. And hopefully we can do a follow-up in a year and see that there's some progress being made.
Awesome. Thanks, Don.
To be a guest or sponsor this podcast, call us at 800-665-0411. To hear more podcasts, visit the podcast page at investorideas.com, www.investorideas.com/audio. And a reminder, you can also hear our podcasts on Spotify, iTunes, TuneIn, Stitcher, Spreaker, iHeartRadio, and Google Play Music. To help you follow and track Cleantech stocks, Investor Ideas has created stock directories just for you. You can visit us and find out more at www.investorideas.com/membership. Investor Ideas reminds all listeners to read our disclaimers and disclosures on the investorideas.com website, and this podcast is not an endorsement to buy or sell products, services, or securities. Investors are reminded that all investment involves possible loss of risk and possible loss of all investment.